Hello, apush students. Mr. Bear here. This is the Period 7 review, which for 2020 is the last period we need to know about. The information we know about the 1950s and the 60s, particularly that stuff about segregation, hold on to all that. That's going to be useful for synthesis. Same thing as potentially Cold War. So it's okay that we got into Period 8, but Period 7's all the content we're going to have to cover. So this video is kind of brief. Frankly, I'm getting tired of making them. I'm sure you're getting tired of listening to them, but we're getting there. Okay, period 7 is 1890 to 1945, so let's get to it. Major dates: 1890 would be the start of the Spanish-American War. 1945 is the end of World War II. They choose these book dates because this shows America finally kind of getting involved in overseas affairs. Some other turning points that aren't necessarily the bookends. Let's keep in mind 1917, which is when the United States gets involved in World War I. 1919, we finally get the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. 1929, the Depression hits, which will be followed a few years later by the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. During that time, there will be World War II beginning in Europe and in Asia, and we will be dragged into the war in 1941. So a good portion of this period, President Franklin Roosevelt is president for 14 years out of 50 something. So major influence in this time. Okay, first major theme for 1890 to 1945 is that we were growing economically, and this causes pressure for economic and societal reform. And it starts with one Roosevelt and ends with another Roosevelt. So we have the progressive age and the square deal. Some concepts we want to attach to that are there is a call by groups like muckrakers, like Upton Sinclair, to have more government regulation in our society. You also had trust busting, this idea that monopolies are wrong. And basically, you have a reversal of a lot of Gilded Age policy through government regulation early in this time period. Then there's sort of a time period where, government involvement kind of takes a step back. The Great Depression happens, and as a response to that, we have more federal involvement in the economy through the New Deal. And you should be aware of many of the New Deal programs. You should also be aware of some of the critics of the New Deal. People like Huey Long would say that the New Deal wasn't enough, that we need wealth redistribution in America. Critics would say that Roosevelt overstepped his power through things like court packing. We do have the 22nd Amendment that passed. The Great Depression and the New Deal put us into this path of forever debt spending and Keynesian spending, which some people would be critical of the modern day. But yeah. Okay, so I think I talked about muckrakers and Sinclair. Lasting programs that the New Deal continued are Social Security, which is a vital government pension program that still exists, and people talk about the future of that. And you should also know this whole alphabet of New Deal programs that were created at the time. I'm not going to go over all of them here, but you should be able to name a couple, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, FDIC insurance for banking was a huge change. So then basically what we saw at the start of this period, you had federal intervention in the economy through regulation and trust busting. By the end of 1945, you have it through a lot of ways: jobs programs, pensions, banking reform. So throughout this period, we see the federal government getting more and more involved economically. Okay, another major concept of this era is that there is emerging technology, which leads to media and culture. By 1945, you don't really have television, but you see radio and a lot of mass media that takes place. There's also a lot of migration. Looking at that real quick, so migration, the Great Migration was posed by World War I and caused a lot of people to move from the south to north, in particular cities. As a result of this, we do see the Harlem Renaissance occurring, where African American art, culture, music like jazz becomes popular. There's also a lot of nativism and reaction against this. So keep in mind, in the 1920s, the KKK grew in prominence, and they also became very nativist. We had the Red Scare, which caused a new Alien and Sedition Acts to be passed. There was also our first immigration quota came out of the 1920s. And we should not think that everything was golden for migrated blacks that moved out of the South. We still saw segregation in the North, and there was a lot of hostility. Not just the Klan, but there were a number of race riots and massacres that happened in the 1920s. And segregation does not go away in this period. So, following the Civil War, we had the passage of the 14th Amendment, saying all citizens are to be treated equally, but we go an entire other period without those concerns being seriously addressed. Even if African Americans are more accepted in our culture, in our pop culture at that time, it still does not lead to the end of segregation. Okay, the next key concept is basically we get involved in wars. That increases our role in the world. And I broke this into 3 parts to cover the major wars of the time. So the first one is the Spanish-American War, which is sort of the birth of new American imperialism. Manifest Destiny was done. We had expanded to the Pacific Ocean, and this caused some people to start seeking this idea that we should expand overseas. There becomes a stepping stones theory by writers and historians like Alfred Mahan, talking about the importance of sea power, that we need to take over these places to have overseas markets to Asia. We will do this following the Spanish-American War through occupying the Philippines and other territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the like. And this causes a lot of debate. Is it really American to colonize? It's kind of against our origin story, and people like William Jennings Bryan would speak out against the occupation of the Philippines. There are also a number of people who speak against imperialization for racial reasons, that basically they don't want an intermixing of the races. So there was a degree of that as well. But the Spanish-American War, we gained some overseas territories, and for better or worse, became a little more imperialist. Okay, second war is the Great War, which I quote Yoda here: "Wars do not make one great," but we should know about it and how it got us involved. At the start of the war, we remained a very neutral stance. We did not want to take action, but some events like constant U-boat attacks and the incriminating Zimmerman note would eventually push us into war. Woodrow Wilson got a lot of credit for keeping us out of the war, but then when the war starts, he gets us involved. And we do come in late, but we tip the balance. And after the war, there is American involvement in the Treaty of Versailles. Keep in mind, Woodrow Wilson wrote his 14 points in an attempt to secure lasting peace and protect democracy. And as part of that, he created the League of Nations, which was meant to be a peacekeeping organization. However, America was not down with the League of Nations. And so when it came back home, there were reservationists, people who were kind of concerned about the Treaty of Versailles, and irreconcilables that didn't want us to get involved because they felt it could bring us down into future wars. So even though a American president, Woodrow Wilson, created the idea of a League of Nations, we don't join it. In fact, we kind of returned to isolationism. And even in the years leading up to World War II, there are a lot of groups called non-interventionists who did not want us to get involved in the world, even though it was seen that, fascism and totalitarianism was bad. There's a lot of lingering aftertaste from World War I that kept people from wanting to get involved in a Second World War. So, yeah, World War I was an important influence, and it was for a period sort of the step backwards in American involvement in world affairs. We got involved in the Spanish-American War. We kind of tried to stay out of World War I. We eventually get dragged in. We do a little bit, but then we kind of step back a little bit. until World War II. So, important things about World War II is that it is identified as this great fight for freedom, which it is. Hitler's bad. I mean, like, we can see that. There's no argument that the Holocaust was bad, that militarism was bad. And so the atrocities that we see in World War II really kind of confirm that this is a fight about freedom, although that will leave some lingering questions about American identity following the war. We win the war largely through mobilization of our industry, and it kind of revitalized our economy from Great Depression. The War Production Board, was an important means of doing this by taking control of our industry and producing all of these items to win the war was a huge goal. Obviously we have images of Rosie the Riveter and, rationing and things like that come out of that time period. You should know how we won the war. We opened a second front in Europe through D-Day. We defeated Japan through this process of island hopping, and the war ended with the creation of a devastating new technology of the atomic bomb, which we created through the Manhattan Project. World War II has numerous lasting impacts. We come out of it as a global superpower, along with the Soviet Union, and the animosity between our nation and them will result in the Cold War, which will permeate the next period of time. So, yeah, that's World War II in a really tiny nutshell. That's it for 2020. We've looked at the key concepts. I've broken them down into the most elemental aspects that I could and key concepts that I could to make sure we cover all our bases. Now, we should acknowledge the fact that there is knowledge that comes beyond this, and we should be able to connect it. So a few connections we can make is that World War II, being a fight for freedom and democracy, will later become this domestic issue. If we're fighting for freedom, we have a nation that is segregated racially, that causes us to kind of look internally and kind of calls out some of the hypocrisies of segregation. And that will become an issue. Now, it takes a while. In the 1950s, they kind of ignore that, although some people do bring it up, and you have Brown versus Board of Education in 1955. But, World War II being about democracy will have impacts on how democratic is the United States. The fact that America becomes a global superpower is basically the most impactful event in American history. World War II is a huge tipping point for the United States, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. Prior to World War II, we were a player. In World War II, we are the player. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, international alliances between either us or the Soviet Union were a choice that every country had to make. And I know that sounds very America-centric, but this idea of an American superpower, an American empire, if you will, really comes out of 1945. And that's going to have impact into the modern day. Whenever there's a global conflict, there's question what America's stance is. America's stance on trade becomes a major economic impact. It's frankly huge. A lot of the alliances that we form result in, later conflict, where there's resistance against our presence, and that results in terror attacks and leads to events of the 80s and 90s, and even the modern day. So, unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of that. If you're solid with World War II and its after effects, you got a pretty good understanding of the key concepts for the 2020 exam. Please email me or contact me if you have questions.